The first thing they told me when I reached the Vathari corridor was this: do not speak to the princess. The second thing they told me was that there was no princess, that the woman I might see moving between the supply tents at the eastern edge of the neutral zone was a logistical attaché, a clerical observer, a court functionary of no political consequence, that her presence at the corridor was a minor administrative matter, that her name was not my concern. They told me both things in the same breath and seemed to see no contradiction in that. I was Corporal Derek Orvain, second-tier liaison, Border Facilitation Corps. My job was paperwork. My talent, if I had one, was for sitting very still in a chair for a very long time and not irritating the people who mattered. I had been posted to 3 corridors before this one. I knew how to fill out a transit authorization in the dark, how to make a supply manifest balance when 2 line items had been quietly removed, how to smile at a Vathari court officer in a way that communicated patience without deference. These were not glamorous skills. They were the kind that kept corridors open when everything around them was on fire. The corridor at Karev's edge was not on fire. Not yet. It was autumn in those forests. That is the only word I have for it. Autumn. Though the Vathari have 6 separate terms for the state of a forest. In the season when its color turns and its light goes amber. I learned this later. At the time, I simply noted that the trees were very tall, that their upper canopy had gone the color of old copper, and that the light coming through at late afternoon looked like something had set the air itself to slow burning. The evacuation tents were strung between the trees in a clearing that the Vathari had quietly ceded to Neutral Use 3. Years earlier, during the first wave of the Wrath border crisis, the tents were gray and practical, and they clashed with the forest in a way that felt vaguely embarrassing, as though the Corps had tracked mud across someone's living room and was trying not to draw attention to it. My post was a folding table at the eastern edge of the clearing, a crate of authorization pads, a comm unit that worked when it felt like working, 2 Vathari court officials who were technically my counterparts, and who spent most of their time speaking to each other in low voices and not to me, which suited everyone fine. I had been at that table for 6 days before I saw her. She came out of the tree line at dusk, not from the direction of the main camp, from deeper in, from the old growth section where the trees were wide enough that 3 men standing arm to arm couldn't reach around one. She was carrying a wooden case of some kind, the long, flat sort used for surveying instruments, and she moved through the undergrowth with a careful attention to her footing that made sense once I understood why. Her left eye was clouded, not dramatically. It was not obvious from a distance, not the first thing you noticed. What you noticed first was her height, which was considerable, and the color of her skin, which was a warm, russet brown that caught the amber light and did something complicated with it. Her hair was braided and ash silver, which in a Vathari of her apparent age indicated something hereditary rather than time. Her right eye, when the angle of the light was right, was the color of amber held up to a flame, that specific, moving, unsettled gold. The left eye had that gray-misted quality that I would later learn the Vathari call cavorn, the cloud that comes after an injury when the lens takes damage but the eye survives. She had kept it. Some would not have. She set the case down beside the secondary supply tent, unlatched it, and began assembling something that I couldn't see clearly from my table. Watched her for a moment because there was nothing else moving in that part of the clearing, and because my instinct for stillness had taught me that the things worth understanding were usually the things no one had specifically pointed out. The 2 court officials at my table had stopped talking. Both of them were facing very deliberately away from her. I looked back at my authorization pads. I had 47 transit forms to process before morning. I processed them. She was there the next morning too, the same case, a different section of the tree line. She was doing something to the bark of the larger trees with a small sync instrument that looked like a compass, moving along their trunks at chest height, stopping to note something on a palm-sized recorder. I realized eventually that she was mapping root system stress, recording which trees were being disturbed by the groundwork we'd done laying the supply lines, so that the corridor expansion the Corps had proposed the previous month would not undercut the forest's integrity along the eastern edge. She had been assigned to protect the trees. That was the job they had given the princess: stand in the forest and count the trees we were damaging. I noted this and went back to my forms. I should explain something about the work I do, because it's relevant to understanding what happened next and why. A border liaison posting is not a prestigious assignment. The Corps does not send its high achievers to second-tier corridors to process transit authorizations. It sends people who are reliable, thorough, and unlikely to cause political incidents, which is not the same as being unimportant, but is the same as being structurally invisible. You do your job, and the corridor stays open, and the supply lines move, and the diplomatic arrangements hold together at the seams, and no one higher up the chain of command thinks about you specifically, which is exactly the way it's supposed to work. I had chosen this work deliberately. I had other options early in my Corps service, and I had looked at them and looked at this and decided that the things I was good at, patience, attention to detail, the willingness to sit very still with a complicated problem until it became a simpler one, fit better here than they would have in a career that required visible impact. I was not unhappy about this. I had filled out a great many transit forms, and I had found, without particular surprise, that each one mattered to the person whose transit it authorized. That seemed like enough. The point is that I was already calibrated for the particular art of seeing things that people in more prominent positions had decided not to see. It was the nature of the work. You notice the things others have decided are below notice, and you file them accurately. And sometimes the filing turns out to matter. Sometimes it doesn't. You file it either way. I noticed her. I noticed the way the camp had organized itself around her absence. And I let that fact sit on my table, beside the authorization pads and the comm unit. And I thought about it the way I thought about a transit manifest, with a discrepancy. Not urgently, not with any particular agenda, but with the attention of someone who intends to get the number right. We did not speak for the first 2 weeks. There was no particular reason to. My counterparts handled the Vathari liaison matters that required direct communication. She was on a separate detail entirely, answering to someone in the court forestry division who had no interest in talking to me. I saw her every morning at the tree line and occasionally in the late afternoon, and once at noon when a supply runner got his cart wedged between 2 exposed roots, and she was the nearest person and came over without being asked and helped us lever it free. She did not speak during that either. She assessed the stuck wheel, positioned herself at the rear corner of the cart, and lifted with a controlled efficiency that suggested she had done heavier work than a supply cart in her time. When the wheel came loose, she nodded at me and went back to the tree line. Her name was on the corridor access roster. Every person operating in the neutral zone had their name and designation logged. I processed that roster as part of my regular duties. I had read her name when I processed the original access permissions on my second day. Selene Vora. Forestry Attaché, designation secondary. Authorized access restricted to eastern treeline boundary. I had read it, logged it, filed it, and moved on to the next name. That was my job. What I had not done, what I understood slowly that no one in the corridor had done, was say it. I noticed this on a Tuesday, not because anything particular happened on that Tuesday, but because I had been watching the small social mechanics of the camp for 2 weeks, and the pattern had become clear enough to be uncomfortable. The supply runners who came through the eastern edge would give her a wide berth, not rudely, not with obvious purpose, but in the way people give a wide berth to something they've been quietly told not to engage with. The 2 court officials never addressed her directly. The camp-adeck, who did his morning rounds, would nod in her direction with a careful, brief nod that was more an acknowledgement that she existed than any actual greeting. The Vathari soldiers, who occasionally passed through the corridor on patrol, would look at the middle distance when she was in their line of sight. She had been posted to a camp full of people who had been told, in whatever language the Vathari court used for such things, that she was not quite there. I spent the evening of that Tuesday thinking about this with the specific, slow thoroughness I usually reserved for transit forms. I was not in the habit of involving myself in things that weren't my business. I was a second-tier liaison. My business was the paperwork. The political dynamics of the Vathari court were explicitly not my department. I had been told, in fact, with quiet clarity on my first day, that they were very much not my department. There is a kind of institutional silence that looks like nothing until you see it clearly. And then it looks like everything. I had seen it at other postings, the person whose requests took longer to process, the supply runner whose name got slightly mispronounced each time and nobody corrected, the official whose documentation was consistently filed in the secondary archive rather than the primary one. None of these things were dramatic. None of them were policies you could point at. They were the accumulated weight of small decisions made consistently by people who had been told, in whatever language institutions use for such things, that this person was not quite in the room. I had always found that particular silence difficult to tolerate. Not loudly. I am not a person who does things loudly. But I had, over 11 years at these postings, developed a habit of treating the secondary archive like the primary one, and pronouncing names correctly, and processing requests in the order they arrived regardless of the sender's designation. It was a small habit. It was, I had come to think, a Varith kind of habit. But names was my department. I processed names every day. I filed them, authorized them, confirmed them, and I had never once, in 2 weeks, heard anyone at the corridor say hers. The next morning I came to my table earlier than usual. I had a thermos of something the camp cook called coffee, and which was not quite coffee but was hot and functional, which is all I have ever really needed. She was at the tree line already, further south than usual, crouching to examine the base of one of the old coppers. That is what I had started calling the big amber canopy trees privately, the old coppers, because of the color. I walked to the tree line, not to where she was. I had a reason to be at that end of the clearing. There was a root barrier, post that had shifted overnight and needed to be relogged on the site map. I walked to it, checked it, made my note. I was perhaps 8 meters from where she was crouching. She did not look up. "Selene Vora," I said. She looked up. I was not looking at her. I was making my note on the site map, the way you do when you have a professional reasons for saying something and don't want it to be misunderstood as more than that. "The root barrier at post 7 has shifted 2 centimeters north overnight," I said. "If you're tracking ground disturbance in this section, it might affect your readings." She said nothing for a moment. I finished my note. I put the stylus back in my chest pocket. I looked at the root barrier with the expression of a man, confirming that a root barrier has, in fact, shifted. "Post 7, she said. Her voice was level, with that particular Vathari quality of precision. The consonants exact, the vowels long. Her accord standard was better than my counterparts. The deviation is noted. I had it at 1.8 centimeters. I have it at 2, but I was rounding up. I do not round up. I'll put 1.8 in my log." I went back to my table. I poured myself something from the thermos. I processed 14 transit authorization and did not think about what had just happened for the rest of the morning. She was there when I came back from the midday meal. Not at the tree line. She was at the eastern water point, filling her canteen. The camp had 2 water points. This one was less frequently used because it was further from the main tent row. I needed to refill my thermos. I went to the eastern water point. She filled her canteen and stepped back without comment. I filled my thermos. "The site supervisor wants to run a secondary groundwork survey along the eastern perimeter next week," I said. "For the expansion proposal. If you're still doing route assessments, the timing might conflict." She looked at me with the careful attention of someone recalibrating a measurement. "What date?" she said. "They haven't confirmed." I can send you the notice when it's filed if you give me your channel designation. BFC East 4 for Alpha. I'll log it. You would file a direct communication to a forestry attaché. I file direct communications to everyone in the corridor who has a stake in site plan changes. It's in the standard protocol. She recapped her canteen. The amber eye was studying me in that even, unhurried way that I would come to recognize as her particular form of thinking, not guarded, not suspicious, just thorough. That is the protocol, she said, and walked back toward the tree line. I logged it. I sent her the notice 4 days later when the survey date was confirmed. She sent back a 2-line acknowledgement that was entirely professional, and also the first message I had received from her in writing, which meant it was now in the official log, which meant her name appeared in the official log in connection with a direct communication that I had initiated, which meant that the corridor record now showed that she existed and was doing work that mattered to the site. I am not sure I meant all of that deliberately. I think I meant most of it. The survey came and went. The forestry concern she had flagged in her acknowledgement, a secondary root cluster along the perimeter that the groundwork team hadn't accounted for, turned out to be accurate, and the expansion proposal had to be modified before the Corps would approve it. The site supervisor was mildly irritated. My counterparts were entirely unamused. I logged her contribution as a site note with her name attached, because that was accurate, and because the alternative was filing a report that implied the forestry concern had arisen spontaneously from the survey team, which was not accurate, and inaccurate reports are the kind of thing that causes problems downstream. She didn't say anything about any of this. She went back to the tree line. I started bringing 2 cups to the water point, not every morning, not with any obvious intention. I had a habit of arriving at the eastern water point at roughly the same time she did, and I had a thermos, and on the mornings when the air was cold enough that breath fogged, I would set a second cup on the edge of the water platform and fill it from the thermos and leave it there when I went back to my table. I never offered it directly. I just left it. Whether she took it or not was entirely her own decision. She took it. Not every morning either. About 3 mornings out of 5. On the mornings she didn't take it, she would glance at it, and then at me with an expression that was not quite dismissal and not quite warmth, and I would bring it back to the table and drink it myself. It was on one of those cold mornings, perhaps 6 weeks after I'd arrived at the corridor, that she said something that was not strictly professional. We were both at the water point. She had taken the cup. The forest was doing its amber light morning thing, which it did reliably at this hour, when the sun hit the upper canopy before it reached the clearing floor. We were both looking at it, I think because there was nothing else immediate that required attention. "You know what they say about this posting," she said. It was not a question. I thought about how to answer it. "I've heard several things," I said. "The secondary designation, restricted access, the eastern tree line." She turned the cup in her hands. Her hands were long-fingered in the Vathari way, and she held things very precisely, as though she was always assessing weight and balance. "It is a position designed to be useless. The trees I am documenting will be cleared in the expansion regardless of my findings. The forestry concern I filed for the survey, they will modify the proposal, but the modification will be minimal. I will spend 8 more months at this corridor, and my report will be received by a court official who has already decided what it will say." I listened. "I know this," she said. "The people who assigned me to it know I know this. That is the nature of the posting." I thought about the transit roster, about the way my counterparts looked at the middle distance when she passed. "What are you actually looking for?" I said. "In the trees." She paused. "What do you mean?" "You're thorough," I said. "More thorough than a report that's going to be filed and ignored needs to be. The root cluster you flagged, you'd been tracking that for 2 weeks before the survey. You had data going back to the first week. You didn't file it until you had confirmation from 3 separate measurement points." I picked up my thermos. "So I'm asking what you're actually looking for." She looked at me for a moment that was a little longer than the others. "The old coppers," she said. I waited. "The large trees in the eastern section. They are called vereth in the formal registry. They are the oldest trees in this forest. The root systems run 200 to 300 meters in some cases, interconnected. If the expansion goes forward as proposed, the groundwork will sever 6 primary root junctions." She turned the cup again. "The vereth do not die when a root junction is severed. They adapt. But the adaptation takes 40 to 60 years, and the trees are stressed which makes them vulnerable to the bark fungus that has been moving north from the lower forest for the past decade. If the fungus reaches stressed vereth, the recovery time is not 40 years. It is 300. You're trying to stop the expansion. I am trying to document it accurately so that someone at some point has a record of what was lost and why. That's not the same as stopping it." "No," she said, "it is not." I drank my coffee. The forest went on doing its slow amber burning in the upper canopy. "I'll file the root junction data as a site-critical addendum," I said, "separate from the survey. If it goes in as site-critical, it has to be addressed in the final approval, not just received." She looked at me. "A forestry addendum from a secondary designation attaché doesn't meet the threshold for site-critical. A forestry addendum co-filed by the corridor liaison does." Silence. "That would be," she said carefully, "a significant extension of your standard filing duties." "I file a lot of things," I said. "I'm good at it." She looked at me for a long time. The amber eye was doing that thorough, unhurried thinking. The clouded eye caught the light differently. Not brightly, but not without light entirely. More like how light looks through water. "Why?" she said. It was a fair question. I thought about it honestly. "The vereth are 300 years old," I said. That seemed like information worth having in the record. That was part of it. It was not all of it, but it was the part I could say in a professional context and have it be accurate, which is the kind of answer I prefer. She gave the cup back to me. She went back to the tree line. 3 days later, she brought me her full data set. Every measurement, every root junction coordinate, the 12-week tracking log, the fungal progression maps from the lower forest registry, a projected impact model that someone had spent significant late-night hours constructing. She set it on my table in a sealed data case and said nothing. I filed it as a site-critical addendum. My name and designation on the cover, her data, her findings, her name in every footnote because she had done the work, and the record was going to be accurate. The approval came back from Core Central 6 weeks later. The expansion proposal was suspended pending an independent environmental assessment. It was the first time in 4 years that a corridor expansion at this tier had been suspended rather than simply modified. I was at my table when the notification came through. She was at the tree line. I printed a hard copy. The Corps still used hard copies for official notifications, which I had always thought was either admirably traditional or quietly absurd. And I walked to the tree line and handed it to her. She read it. She read it a second time. She stood there in the amber light of the old coppers for a moment that had the quality of something carefully held. "The vereth," she said. "They'll run the independent assessment in spring," I said. "It's not a guarantee, but it's a process." "Yes," she said. "It is a process." She folded the notification with the same precise weight-assessing attention she gave everything. She put it in the breast pocket of her field jacket. "Orvain," she said. "Corporal is fine." "Orvain," she said again, as though testing whether the name held. "Why do you say my name?" I had been waiting for this question. I had been thinking about how to answer it since the first morning at the root barrier post. "Because it's your name," I said. "And you're here." Both of those things seem like relevant information. She looked at me with the amber eye and the clouded eye, and the expression that was not warmth, yet but was somewhere in the vicinity of warmth. At the place where careful people stand, when they are not yet sure they can trust that something is what it appears to be. "Most people do not find them relevant," she said. "Most people are wrong about what's relevant." She didn't answer that. She went back to her measurements. I went back to my table. That was the shape of it for a while. We had a rhythm. the water point in the mornings, her data and my filing. The addendum had moved things, but slowly. The Vathari court moved the way old courts do, with the gravity of accumulated precedent, and a suspended corridor expansion was not the kind of thing that resolved in weeks. She kept measuring. I kept filing. We did not speak about the court or the princess designation or the cavorn, or why she had been posted to stand in a forest and count trees for 8 months. We spoke about the trees. We spoke sometimes about other things. She asked me once about Earth's forests, not because she had a professional interest. She was simply curious. I had grown up near a temperate forest in the northern part of my home region, the kind with birches and soil that went dark and soft in the rain, and I told her about it with the stumbling imprecision of someone describing something they had experienced rather than studied. She listened with her full attention, which with her meant complete stillness, and eyes that were following the shape of the story rather than waiting for the information. I asked her once about the Varith, not the technical data, but what they looked like from the inside of one if you stood close enough. She took me to one, not during the workday. On a rest day, in the late afternoon, when the light was doing the amber thing most completely, she walked me to the oldest of the old coppers, the one at the far end of the eastern section, where the corridor survey hadn't reached. It was immense. The bark was not brown. It was closer to red-gray, layered in long vertical ridges with a texture like something had been slowly pressing it from the inside for a very long time. The root system had created a low-mounded terrain around the base, and you had to step carefully between the root edges, and she moved through this without looking down, which made sense because she had been walking this section for months and had mapped every root edge without needing to see it. She put her hand on the bark, palm flat, the way you put your hand on something to feel its temperature. 312 years, she said, by the ring count in the core sample taken in the registry survey. I put my hand next to hers on the bark. It was warm, not dramatically, not as warm as living skin, but warmer than I expected. The warmth of something with deep internal mass that holds the day's heat after the surface has cooled. In our language, she said, the word for this tree is the same root as the word for patient. What's the word? Varith. She said it differently than she had before. Not the clipped registry pronunciation, but something longer, with more breath behind it. The eth suffix indicates continuity, something that endures by continuing to do a small thing consistently, not by surviving dramatically. No, by showing up every year, doing the same small thing. I thought about filing. I thought about transit forms. I thought about a folding table at the edge of a clearing and a root barrier post that had shifted 8 centimeters and how that had seemed like a reason to say a name. I understand that, I said. She took her hand from the bark. I know you do, she said. We walked back through the forest in the amber light. We did not say anything else because there was nothing that needed saying. The trees were there. We were there. Both of those things seemed like relevant information. The court representative arrived in the 3rd month. He came with 4 attendants and a diplomatic transport that was too large for the landing strip and had to park in the secondary field, which inconvenienced several supply runs and created 3 hours of rescheduling work that I handled without particular grace. His name was Advocate Sothran Vor, 2nd Chamber, Court of the Interior, and he had the specific polished quality of a Vathari official who had been in polished rooms for long enough that he had stopped noticing them. He presented himself at my table with a formal greeting and the clear expectation that I would defer to his rank, which I did, because that is standard protocol, and I had no reason to make it complicated. He asked to see the logistical records for the corridor's eastern section. I gave him the logistical records for the corridor's eastern section. He spent 40 minutes with them. I processed transit authorizations. The site-critical addendum, he said, without looking up from the records. Filed by this office. That's correct. It references a forestry assessment conducted by a secondary designation attaché. He said the designation with the careful neutrality of someone who means it as a descriptor, but is relying on the listener to understand what it implies. The forestry addendum was based on a 12-week dataset, I said. The root junction coordinates were independently verifiable. The fungal progression model cited 3 external registry sources. The data was accurate. The filing decision was mine, I said. It met the threshold. I filed it. He looked up. He had that quality some high-ranking Vaithari court officials have, of seeming to be doing several calculations simultaneously and keeping the results behind their eyes. He was good-looking in the angular, precise Vaithari way, and younger than I had expected, and he was looking at me with the specific attention of someone who has just recalibrated what they were dealing with. "Corporal Orvain," he said. "Yes. Are you aware of the position of the court regarding the designation of the attaché in question?" "I'm aware that she was posted to the secondary forestry detail on restricted access terms," I said. "I'm aware that the posting was designed to limit her operational impact. I'm aware that her name isn't used in the camp by anyone who reports to the court. I'm aware that her data was accurate, and her findings were significant, and the suspension of the expansion proposal is the result of her work." I picked up my stylus. "If you're asking whether I'm aware of the political context, yes. I have a working understanding of it." He was quiet for a moment. "She is not a suitable match," he said. It came out more plainly than I think he intended, as though the calculation had slipped through the formal register. "For any purpose the court is currently." "I don't work for the court," I said. "I work for the Corps. The Corps gave me a corridor to run and a protocol to follow. The protocol says I file accurate records. I did that." He looked at me with something that was not quite respect and not quite annoyance, and had elements of both. "The K-vorn," he said. "You understand what it means, what it indicates to the court." "I understand it's an eye injury. It is a sign of impaired function. The court has protocols. The court's protocols don't govern my filing desk." I set the stylus down. "She mapped 300 meters of root junctions with one good eye and saved trees that are 3 centuries old. I think her function is fine." He did not say anything for a moment. He was very good at the neutral expression. I will give him that. He had the politician's ability to absorb an unexpected statement and continue looking as though he had expected it. But there was something behind the neutral expression that was recalibrating, and I had been watching people think in formal Vaithari register long enough to see it. "You are aware," he said carefully, "that the Interior Court has a long-established relationship with this corridor." "I'm aware." "And that the arrangement regarding the secondary designation posting was made at a level above this office." "I'm aware of that too." "Then you understand that a co-filing from this level met the threshold," I said. "The data met the site-critical threshold as defined by Core Protocol Section 14, Subsection 3. I filed it. If the court would like to dispute the threshold determination, they are welcome to file a formal challenge with Core Central. I'll provide the supporting records." He looked at the records in front of him and then at me. "You have been in the Corps for how long, Corporal?" 11 years. 11 years at second-tier postings. 11 years at postings where the work needed doing." I picked up my stylus again. "The work needed doing. I did it." He closed the record case with the controlled precision of someone who is choosing not to express something they are feeling. "The forestry attaché," he said. "In your assessment, as a liaison, she's thorough, accurate, and her analysis was correct. The root junction data was good. The fungal progression model was good. The site-critical designation was the correct designation. The court's assessment of her suitability for certain functions isn't in my protocol," I said. "My protocol covers this corridor and the accuracy of the records I file in it. That's the limit of my jurisdiction, and I haven't exceeded it." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he asked to see the addendum itself. I printed him a copy. He read it with the careful attention of someone who knows data when he sees it, and has the unwelcome experience of seeing data that is very good. He folded it into his case. "The court will be reviewing the corridor arrangements," he said, in the tone of someone who wants that to sound like a warning. "I'll update the relevant records when I receive the official notification," I said. He left the next morning. His transport inconvenienced the supply runs again on the way out. She came to the water point that morning at the usual time. I had the thermos. She took the cup. We both looked at the forest for a while. "Southern Vor," she said. He reviewed the eastern section records. I know. I saw his transport in the secondary field. He was very interested in the addendum filing. She was quiet for a moment. "He was sent to assess whether there was a problem," she said, "with my presence here. With the addendum, I think, which is connected to your presence here. He will recommend to the court that the posting arrangement be reviewed. Probably. That review may result in my reassignment." "It might." She turned the cup. "You filed the addendum knowing this might happen." "I filed the addendum because the data was accurate and the threshold was met," I said. "What happens after that is the court's business." She looked at me. "Orvain," she said. "Selene," I said. I had not used her given name before. It sat differently in the air than her full name. Shorter, more immediate. The kind of name that expects to be answered. She looked at me with the amber eye and the clouded eye, and neither of them was guarded. "What do you want from this?" she said. It was not unfriendly. It was the question she had been measuring for months, putting it down and picking it up, testing its weight. "Nothing specific," I said honestly. "I wanted to say your name because you were there and it was accurate. I wanted to file the data because it was good data and it met the threshold. I wanted to bring you coffee in the mornings because the mornings here are cold and you were already at the water point." I looked at the old coppers. None of those things required anything from you. And yet here we are. And yet here we are. The forest was quiet in the particular way old forests are quiet. Not absence of sound, but the presence of a deeper register underneath the sounds. The way you can hear the weight of the trees themselves if you stand still long enough. "In the Vathari court," she said, "the cavorn is a disqualifying condition for a formal match, any formal match. The protocols are not ambiguous." She held the cup with both hands. "My father's court has had those protocols for 6 generations. They were written after a period when the dynastic lines contracted significantly due to poorly assessed matches. They are considered a safeguard. A safeguard that says a person with a clouded eye can't be paired. That says a person with impaired function cannot hold certain positions. The pairing protocols are a subset of the function assessments. Your function," I said, "produced the most rigorous environmental assessment this corridor has received in 4 years. My function is not in question," she said. "The court's protocol is not about function. It is about precedent, about what is considered settled." I thought about this. "Settled by people who aren't here," I said. "Settled by people with authority over people who are here." She looked at the cup. "My mother," she said quietly, "could have challenged the protocol. When the cavorn was assessed, there is a process. She chose not to initiate it." A pause. She said the protocols were for the court's stability, not for my limitation. "That I should understand the distinction, do you?" "I understand what she meant," she said. I'm not certain she was right. We were quiet for a while after that. "The Vareth," I said eventually. "The word that means patient. The thing that endures by showing up and doing the small thing consistently." She looked at the forest. "Yes, that's not nothing," I said. "Being the thing that shows up. Being there when it matters, without needing the acknowledgement. It's not glamorous. But the trees are 300 years old. You're comparing me to a tree. I'm comparing consistency to a tree. The tree is already doing the comparison for you. You're the one who told me the word." Something shifted in her expression. Not dramatically. The way light shifts when a cloud moves. The difference between the quality of the light before and the quality of the light after. "Orvain," she said. "Derek," I said, "if we're doing names." The shift went a little further. The amber eye was doing the thorough, unhurried thing. And what it was thinking through was visible at the edges in a way it had not been before. "Derek," she said, testing whether it held. "Yes, the court will review the posting. Yes, the review may go badly for both of us. It might, and you would still file the addendum again. The data was accurate, I said. Yes, she gave me the cup back. Our hands were close to the same temperature in the cold morning air. She did not move her hand immediately, and I did not move mine, and that was not a declaration of anything. It was just two people who had been careful about things, noticing that the care was not required at this particular moment, in this particular cold morning, and choosing briefly not to exercise it. The Varith in the eastern section, she said, the one at 312 years. What about it? There is a secondary growth on the north side, a young tree, perhaps 30 years. It has established itself within the root perimeter of the old one. The registry does not note it because the survey was cursory, but the young tree's roots are already interwoven with the outer edge of the old root system. She looked at the forest. They are too different for the joining to make obvious sense. But it has been 30 years, and neither has displaced the other. I looked at the forest too. That's in your report? I said. It will be. Then it will be in the addendum. We went back to our respective corners of the corridor. I had 42 transit authorizations waiting, and a supply manifest that had developed a discrepancy in the previous day's log. She had root measurements and a fungal progression update, and the young Varith to document. The court review was a thing that would happen when it happened, and we were both still here, and the trees were still standing, and the authorization pads needed to be filled out because that was the work. The court review took 11 weeks. I know this because I counted, not because I was worried. Exactly. I had a talent for not borrowing trouble from a future that hadn't happened yet, but because it was the kind of number that wanted to be exact. 11 weeks of official silence from the Vathari Interior Court, during which Selene continued to map the eastern section, and I continued to file accurate records, and we continued to meet at the water point in the mornings when the air was cold enough that breath fogged. We talked more in those weeks, not about the review, about other things. She told me about the lower forest, the route the bark fungus was taking, the species it had already taken from the registry. She told me about the work she had done before the corridor posting, in a different part of the territory, where the trees were different and the root systems ran differently, and the survey techniques had to be adapted. She told me about the woman who had trained her in the field assessments, an older Vathari with a deliberately methodical approach to measurement who had apparently never filed a cursory report in her life. She described that woman the way you describe someone you measure yourself against, not with rivalry, but with the particular quiet of respect for a thing you aspire to match. The older Vathari had worked at postings that were not prestigious either. She had spent 40 years doing accurate work in places where accuracy was not the primary political priority. And when she retired, her report archive was apparently the most complete and reliable environmental record in the lower forest district, used by researchers who had no idea who she was or why the data was so thorough. She said to me once, Selene told me, on a morning when the frost had just reached the clearing floor and we could see our breath in the amber light, that the only thing a person can guarantee is the quality of the next measurement. Not what's done with it, not how it's received, just the measurement itself. Your trainer sounds like she understood the work. She understood what the work is actually for. Not recognition, not impact necessarily. Documentation. She looked at the cup, the record that something was there and what it was, so that whoever comes after has something accurate to build on. That's what you've been doing at this corridor. Yes, she paused. And then you filed it, which made it something else. It made it accessible. It made it matter in the present tense, she said, not just for whoever comes after. I thought about this. It had not occurred to me to frame it that way. I had filed the addendum because the data was good and the threshold was met, and those were sufficient reasons. But she was right that the filing had changed its relationship to time, moved it from a future record to a present intervention. Both things are important, I said. Yes, she said, both things are important. She told me, in pieces over several mornings, about the court. Not with bitterness. She was not a person who expressed things with bitterness, any more than the Vareth expressed its centuries of growth with urgency. She told me about it the way she told me about the fungal progression, as a phenomenon with causes and directions that could be mapped if you were willing to look at it steadily. The protocols had been written in a period of dynastic contraction. She understood why they existed. She had had the nature of them explained to her at a young age by her mother, who was precise about explanations. And she had understood even then that the protocols were not about her specifically, but about a pattern the court was trying to prevent. This did not make them less limiting. It made them a fact of a particular kind, the kind that is both explicable and wrong, and she had spent some years deciding what relationship to have with that. "The posting here," she said one morning. "My mother suggested it. I had not expected that. Your mother suggested the secondary designation. She suggested that I accept a posting outside the court territories for a period, that I use the time to document something worth documenting." She held the cup in both hands. She did not say it directly. She is not direct in that way. But she sent me the forestry assessment vacancy 3 weeks before the court formally offered it. She wanted you out of the court. She wanted me somewhere I could work without the protocols being the immediate context. A pause. I was angry at first. I'm less angry now. I thought about this. "She gave you the Vareth," I said. She looked at me with something that shifted. I hadn't thought of it that way. 312 years of patient work that no one in the official court gave 2 thoughts to. She sent you to spend time with things that had been doing the small, consistent thing without requiring acknowledgement. I looked at the old coppers at the tree line's edge. That's not a dismissal. That's a mother sending her daughter to study something worth studying. She was quiet for a long time. "I will write her a letter," she said finally. Good. She did write the letter. She mentioned it to me a week later in a way that was not asking for response, but was the kind of thing you say to someone you have decided to be honest with. The letter had taken 4 drafts. The 4th draft said what she meant. She had sent it. I told her about the other corridors I'd been posted to. She found them interesting in the way that someone finds interesting the particulars of a job they've never thought about, the logistics, the paperwork, the specific human mechanics of keeping a supply line running when 3 variables are trying to stop it simultaneously. She asked good questions. She had the kind of mind that goes for the load-bearing point of a structure rather than the surface detail. I told her about my counterparts in the Accord, the colleagues I'd served with at previous postings. She listened with a particular care to the parts of those stories that were about people being quietly decent to each other in difficult circumstances. The mechanic at the 2nd corridor who had fixed a Vethary's ply-through vehicle without being asked. The medic at the 3rd corridor who had learned 3 phrases of the local dialect specifically to be able to thank people properly. Small things. The Vareth type of things. "You collect these," she said once. "What do you mean?" "The examples, the small decent acts. You hold them." "I suppose I do." "Why?" "Because," I said, thinking it through. "There are people who think that large dramatic things are what matter. And there are people who think that small, consistent things are what matter. I believe both groups are right, and I believe the second group is underrepresented." She looked at me for a long time. "The court," she said, "does not tend to send its formal representatives to corridors like this one, the 2nd-tier liaison posts, the restricted access details." She held her cup. "The things that happen here tend not to reach official notice, unless someone files them." "Yes," she said, "unless someone files them." The notification of the court review's conclusion came on a Wednesday, which is a fact I remember, because Wednesday was when the weekly supply manifest came in, and I had to process both simultaneously, which was complicated. The notification was from the Interior Court, directed to both the corridor office and the Corps Regional Command. It was 3 paragraphs. It was informal Vathary, which I can read adequately but not elegantly, and I read it twice to be sure I had understood it correctly. The addendum was confirmed as properly filed. The environmental assessment was upheld. The suspension of the expansion proposal was made permanent pending a full independent review. And in the third paragraph, in the clipped administrative language of a Vathari court document that was trying very hard to be about something other than what it was about, the secondary designation forestry posting was retroactively reclassified as primary tier, effective from the date of the addendum filing, which meant that every piece of work Selene had done at this corridor was now on the record as primary tier documentation, which meant her name was in the official registry under a designation that was not designed to be useless. I printed it. I walked to the tree line. She was at the Vareth, the old one, the 312-year one. She was on her knees at the base of the young growth on the north side, measuring the interweaving of the root systems with the careful, patient precision she brought to every measurement. I handed her the notification. She read it standing up. The way you read something when you've been waiting 11 weeks, and your body can't hold still enough to stay in a crouch. She read it twice. She was quiet for a long time. The forest was quiet too, that deep register quiet. The weight of old things that have been doing the small thing consistently for long enough that the doing of it has become structural. Primary tier, she said. From the date of the addendum filing, I said. That is, she stopped. She turned the notification in her hands. That is 6 months of records reclassified. Yes, the court does not typically. I know. She looked at me. The amber eye was doing the thorough thing. And underneath the thoroughness was something that was either the place before tears or the place before. Unexpected laughter, and in someone like her, those places were close together and both were serious. Someone in the interior court, she said slowly, reviewed 11 weeks of corridor records and found that the work was primary tier and corrected the classification. That's what the notification says. And the young Vareth, she said, it is in the protected registry now, as a secondary growth of a primary assessed specimen. 30 years of showing up, I said. It earned the notation. She looked at the young tree for a moment. Then she looked at me. Derek, she said, Selene. There was a quality to the way she said my name that was new. Not different. She had always said it with precision, the way she said everything. But the precision was doing a different thing now. It was not just identifying me. It was keeping something steady. I have been posted to difficult places, she said. Before this, I know the particular shape of being assigned to work that is designed to be invisible. Yes, what you did. She stopped again, the filing, the addendum, the water point. She looked at the forest. No one at those other postings said my name. I thought about this. About the 2 Vathari officials who still carefully looked at the middle distance when she passed. About the supply runners who gave her the quiet berth. About Advocate Southern Vor and his careful assessment of the secondary designation and what it implied. Your name is accurate information, I said. You were here. Both things seemed worth noting. She put the notification into her breast pocket, next to where she had put the first one. She would have them both in there now, the 2 pieces of paper, the 2 records, the suspension and the reclassification. She stood in the amber light of the old Vareth and looked at me, and what was in her eyes was not complicated. It was the look of someone who has been patient for a long time and has just seen that the patience has produced a thing worth seeing. I would like, she said carefully, to show you the south end of the eastern section. There is a cluster of young Vareth there, 6 of them, approximately the same age, that established themselves at the same period. The survey did not document them at all. They are not in any registry. That should probably be corrected, I said. It should. It will require a co-file documentation report. She almost smiled. The amber eye was doing something complicated with the light. You file things well. I do. Then perhaps, she said, we should go look at the south end. We went to the south end of the eastern section. The young Vareth were there, 6 of them, clustered in a clearing of their own making. Perhaps 30 meters from the boundary of the survey area that had never quite reached them. They were not impressive yet. Not like the old one, not 300 years of accumulated presence, but they were there, and they had been there for 30 years without anyone noting them. Doing the small thing consistently in the place they had established. She measured, I noted. We filed the documentation report jointly the following morning with both our names on it, hers in the primary field and mine in the co-filing field, and it went into the official registry of the corridor at Karev's edge, accurate and permanent and very much there. The young Varith are in the protected registry now. So is the 30-year growth by the old one. The old one is there too, of course. Has been there for 312 years. Will be there long after the corridor and the tents and the folding table and the thermos and the authorization pads are gone. I am still at the corridor. The posting was extended after the environmental review was confirmed. The Corps wanted continuity in the liaison role during the independent assessment process, which was going to take at least another year. Possibly 2. I did not object to this. I have never found the work here anything other than worth doing. Selene's posting was reclassified and formalized as a primary tier environmental oversight role for the duration of the assessment. The court interior representative who sent the notification was not Advocate Southern Vor, someone else, someone I don't know. The notification was 3 paragraphs and entirely professional, and her name was in it in the primary field with no qualifier and no secondary designation. We still meet at the water point in the mornings when the air is cold. I still bring the thermos. She still takes the cup about 3 mornings out of 5, and on the mornings she doesn't. She glances at me with an expression that by now I recognize as its own form of warmth. On the mornings she does. We stand in the forest light and sometimes we talk and sometimes we don't, and both are fine. I said her name the first time because she was there and it was accurate. I say it every morning now for the same reason, which has not changed except that the reason has become more precise. She is here. Her name is accurate. Both things seem like information worth repeating. The Varith outside are doing the small thing. 312 years of it. We have time.